All right, welcome everybody to Audubon Great Lakes webinar, Hope for the Black Tern. We know everyone has a busy life and we really appreciate you spending the next hour with us. My name is Erin Rowan and I'm the Conservation Associate for Audubon Great Lakes, and I will be your facilitator for tonight's presentation with the help of Stephanie Bielke, our Conservation Science Manager, Isabella Grobelna, our Chapter Network Associate, and Kristen Murphy, our Government Affairs Associate. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This presentation is being recorded, so all participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar. Please take a moment to locate the participant and chat function on the Zoom platform to actively participate in the webinar. To send a question or comment to the facilitator, please use that chat box. If you're participating via Facebook Live, please submit your question or comment in the comment section. If you're not joining us on the webinar and are only using the phone, you can email your question to Stephanie Bielke at stephanie.bielke@audubon.org. And that is stephanie.bielke@audubon.org. Questions will be answered by speakers at the end of the presentation. During the Q&A session, you're invited to ask your question verbally. So please click on that blue raise hand button to digitally raise your hand. We will then unmute you when it's time for your question. This webinar is organized by Audubon Great Lakes, which is a regional office of National Audubon Society. In the Great Lakes watershed, we're one of 4 Audubon's field offices working across the 5 states of Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. You might be an Audubon member in this region. Our hope is that webinars like this one will help us stay connected during this time. With that, I'll pass things off to Stephanie Bielke, our Conservation Science Manager.
Oh, sorry about that. Looks like I was on mute. Thanks, Erin. Thank you all so much for coming. And it looks like we have people joining from across the Great Lakes region and beyond. We have some folks joining us in the chat saying they're from Illinois, Michigan, Ontario. Great to have you all here, and also from outside the region as well. Of course, everyone is welcome. Great to have everyone here, and we're excited to have you learn about Black Terns with us tonight. So I'm just going to be announcing our speakers tonight. We're having Don Lyons start. He's the director of Audubon's Seabird Restoration Program, and he's going to be presenting on how Audubon is leading restoration of colonial waterbirds and why these unique water-loving birds are just so important. And then following Don, we're going to get into some of our Black Tern specific work in the Great Lakes. We're going to be kicking that off with Ava Landgraf, who's the research coordinator for Detroit Audubon. And she's going to be discussing her work with one of the most charismatic waterbirds in the Great Lakes, at least in our opinion anyway, which is the Black Tern. And she's going to be focusing on that work that's happening in St. Clair Flats, Michigan, which is outside of Detroit. Next, we'll hear from Dave Moore, who is the senior waterbird biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service. And Dave will be sharing his research that's focused on tracking black tern movements between their Great Lakes breeding grounds and their tropical wintering grounds. And then finally, we'll hear again from Erin, who just introduced us. And she is the Conservation Associate with Audubon Great Lakes. And Erin will be diving into the expansion of our Black Tern work across the Great Lakes region, and will outline some of our next steps to help the species, and that is of increasing conservation concern. So thank you all again for joining us. We will be starting out hearing again from Don Lyons. So introducing Don, he's the director of Audubon Seabird and Restoration Program. So take it away, Don.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great, great, thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction, and thanks everyone who's joined this webinar for the opportunity to share some information on waterbirds, their science, and their conservation today. Next slide. So I'm sure many of you, maybe all of you, know that the great egret is the official bird of the National Audubon Society, but maybe not everyone knows why that bird was chosen. Well, the Audubon movement really began in the late 1800s, a long time ago, in response to overexploitation of many waterbird species for the millinery trade. Actually, bird feathers and even whole bird bodies sometimes were used to adorn women's hats. And great egrets, of course, are beautiful birds and have incredible breeding feathers, and were very desired during this period for that reason. And hunters became very adept at finding the colonies of egrets and other water birds and harvesting them and causing a conservation problem for that species and for many species of colonial nesting water birds. But fortunately, passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1918 really helped alleviate this problem and was probably the first major bird conservation law passed in the United States. So waterbirds played a key role in that initial bird conservation effort. Next slide. Another historical challenge for waterbirds occurred in the latter half of the 20th century when waterbirds and other species accumulated really hazardous levels of the chemical pesticide DDT in their bodies. Those high concentrations led to real challenges in formation of eggshells. So the eggs were very fragile and easily broken during this period, even when birds were just doing normal incubation, just trying to keep the eggs warm. And so that led to widespread breeding failure among some species, like the brown pelican pictured here, and real population declines. Fortunately, in this case, DDT was banned in North America in the 70s, and that led to the recovery of brown pelicans, bald eagles, osprey, and a number of other species that were impacted. Next slide. Even with our successful addressing those two major conservation challenges, though, there are still a number of waterbirds in decline well into the 20th century now. Seabirds are a group of waterbird species that nest on islands, along our coastlines, or even out on islands far away from continents. And as a group, they're a well-documented example of continued declines of waterbirds. Certainly, there's many other species that are also in decline, including our focus species today, the Black Tern. Next slide. Well, there are a number of unique traits to waterbirds that are very important when we're thinking about their conservation. Probably the first is their colonial breeding habit, and with in the age of plume hunting, that was a significant handicap because hunters knew where to go to find birds year after year, find large numbers of birds, and so they could very effectively harvest large portions of the population, which was a real challenge for the conservation of these species. The second trait that I'll focus on is that they are upper trophic level consumers which is really just a scientist's way of saying they exist high on the food chain. And when you're high on the food chain, you're very dependent on everything below you. In the case of DDT, DDT actually entered the food chain very low on the chain, at a low rung, if you will, or low link. Insects or marine invertebrates. And at each link of the chain, as you went up, DDT was concentrated in the body of those species. So by the time you got to an upper level consumer, DDT was quite concentrated and thus much more of a problem. A third trait that impacts the conservation of these species is the fact that many are long-distance migrants. And Dave will allude to this a little better, or really show you what we mean here. But for long-distance migrants, that just increases the number of places we need to protect to help these birds persist. A final trait that's really important is that these species are generally long-lived. And like a lot of long-lived species, that's coupled with a very low reproductive rate. In birds, that means a small clutch size, not very many eggs. And so they're limited in how fast they can reproduce. And if a population goes into decline, recovery can take a long time, just because that ability to reproduce is constrained each year. Next slide. So there's a familiar maxim, don't put all your eggs in one basket. When it comes to colonial water birds, some species are putting most or all of their eggs in one or just a few baskets. These roseate terns in the Northeast US are endangered, but unfortunately are putting almost all their eggs in just 3 colonies or baskets, and so are at risk to problems that might affect that local area in New York and Massachusetts, things like a regional oil spill or offshore wind development, which is actually happening in this area. So this fact that they're colonial and that we've constrained how many colonies they have access to is a real risk for their long-term conservation. Next slide. Another risk to the conservation of some waterbird species is that from waterbird species that we as people subsidize. And kind of the keynote example for waterbirds is the group of gull species that do really well in association with people, often because they're finding food at refuse dumps, landfills, or fish processing facilities, or even agricultural fields. That can really enhance their populations, and then they become much more effective competitors or even predators on rare waterbird species. Gulls are very efficient egg predators and small chick predators. And so this is a way that we modify kind of the ecology so that some rare waterbird species are more challenged. Next slide. Another way we challenge waterbirds is by competing with them for sometimes scarce resources. This beautiful photo is of a double-crested cormorant, and cormorants are very efficient fish predators and very visible fish predators, and sometimes they're perceived to be competing for the same fish that we like to catch and eat ourselves. And that perception leads to calls for cormorant management, and that almost never works out well for the cormorant. So competing with us for scarce resources, whether it's food or space, is a challenge that more and more species face in the 21st century. Next slide. Kind of playing off that, another way we compete with birds is for space. These charming least terns nest on beaches, and beaches are one of the most popular places where we like to go and recreate, walk our dogs, spend a lot of time, and we risk disturbing these birds at their nest site and causing problems, potentially causing a problem that they abandon their nest or are exposed to a predator. And so this is yet another way that we impact some of these waterbird species. Next slide. I want to say, though, that while waterbirds are challenged in many ways, we can help. If we focus on their conservation, we have some tools that are tested and demonstrated to be successful. That's what I want to spend the remainder of my time talking with you about. Next slide. I'll start with probably the most straightforward conservation action we can take for any species, and that's really set aside and protect habitat. An example of that that Audubon's actively doing is in Maine. There's examples across the country from Audubon and many other organizations, but in Maine, the Project Puffin program that runs under Audubon's auspices manages a network of 7 islands for rare and threatened seabirds. And this is just an example of the type of habitat protection that waterbirds need. Next slide. Setting aside space is not enough, however, that the habitat in that space needs to be appropriate for the species we're interested in, that we want to help. In this case, for Caspian terns, pictured here, the appropriate habitat is bare sand. That's their preference for nesting. So the management is the removal of exotic invasive vegetation. In this case, a European beach grass that was quite invasive at this site along the Oregon coast. Next slide. And once you have space set aside and the appropriate habitat, if you don't get birds right away, there are some things we can do to attract them, to bring them to the site and show them that it's good habitat and a good place for them to be. We as scientists call that social attraction. And you can see in the photos here, that involves putting some reasonably realistic looking decoys out. Here are some Atlantic puffin decoys and common tern decoys. You could also use a mirror box, which would show a bird its reflection. And along with those decoys, play recorded sounds of that species at a colony. Real birds are attracted to these artificial colonies, if you will, and they're also reassured that it's a safe place because they're seeing other birds there. And once you have a few real birds land and check it out, they do pretty quickly start to ignore the decoys and just focus on each other and find mates then and begin their nesting cycle. Next slide. Once you have birds there, there are some actions you may need to take after that. And that one example of that can be managing predators if need be. And that can take a lot of different forms. But with owls, for example, like this great horned owl pictured here, That can mean capturing that individual and moving it, in this case, several hundred miles away from the main coast. And then it typically won't come back. Occasionally they can and will. In our case here, these two photos are the same individual owl that came back 8 years after our initial capture and move. And so we had recaptured him before very much damage was done to the tern colony in this case, and moved him again, and actually moved him a little bit farther the second time. Next slide. The last step, and it's also a very critically important step, is to monitor what's going on. How are the birds responding to the conservation actions you've taken? While we know a lot about waterbird conservation, every species and every site are unique. And you never know when there's going to be some new challenge or new twist. So without monitoring, we don't know how things are going. And if something goes wrong, we may not know how to fix it. So monitoring is really important. Next slide. If you take care of all of these steps, some of which you may have to actively do, some of which may already be present, birds will respond. And just for a couple examples here from Maine, here's just a trend of common terns and Atlantic puffins and the growth in their populations over the last 4 decades due to following these kinds of conservation measures. So we can make a difference. Birds will respond. Next slide. And these techniques are widely applicable. They've been used now for over 50 species in more than 15 countries. So had a huge benefit across the world and really offer us tools that we can bring to any new conservation challenge for waterbirds really anywhere. That's my portion of the talk. Thanks all for your attention, and I'll turn it over to Stephanie for our next steps.
Thank you so much, Don. And that was an excellent overview of how seabird conservation works and some of the work that Audubon is leading in Maine and the northeast part of the US. But we're gonna migrate from the northeast back to the Great Lakes, and we're gonna be joined by Ava, who is a research coordinator at Detroit Audubon. And Ava is gonna be speaking more about her work and Detroit Audubon's work in southeast Michigan. So take it away, Ava.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. So we can go to the beginning slide. This is the St. Clair Flats Black Tern monitoring. I am the research coordinator for Detroit Audubon, and so I supervise this work of monitoring this colony. So we can go to the next slide. So to start off, I'll just talk about the appearance of black terns. These guys are about the size of a blue jay or a robin, but their wings are much longer, and that is because they are long distance migrants that I'll get into a little bit more. The breeding adults have this plumage that you can see here on the left. It's the black head and body with these gray wings, and then the juveniles are white and gray. They have this distinct little gray cap with a little gray ear mark. And then when the adults are going back to their non-breeding areas, they will actually get a molt that is similar to the juvenile. Next slide. So you can see here with the red up here, that is where the black terns breed. They breed in Canada and the US in marshy areas. The Great Lakes and the marshes attached to them are extremely important nesting sites for the black terns. And then this yellow is their migration areas, and then they spend their non-breeding time in the winter is down off the coast of Central and South America here. And we can go to the next slide. So for feeding, black terns eat mostly little fish and larger insects. You can see that this one here on the left has a nice big dragonfly. When they're in the marshy areas, they eat more insects, and then down when they're over the ocean, they're eating more of these small fish, such as sardines or anchovies. And then I have a quick video here that is just showing a parent dropping off food to its babies. It's very cute.
Got it.
And it looks like it was a big bug that it dropped off. And you can see how graceful they are. I mean, it just passed it to its baby while flying by.
Oh, that was
really
really
cool.
cool.
And I also like this video because you can hear their squeaky call. To me, they sound like a squeaky dog toy. So if you hear that call, that is the black tern. Next slide. To me, one of the most impressive things about the black tern is their nesting. They nest on these floating vegetation mats. You can see here they're made of different materials. So this nest on the left is made of reed materials, kind of like bulrush or cattail. And then the nest on the right is actually what we usually call a lily pad root muck mat. So it's kind of like old lily pad roots that have floated up. And they nest on these and raise their babies on these vegetation mats. Next slide. Like most birds, they have to be very protective of their chicks. There's plenty of animals that would love to eat their babies and their eggs. Some of the common predators that we have out at St. Clair Flats are water snakes, snapping turtles, like this big guy that you can see here floating in the middle of the water, large fish like pike and maybe even bass. And then some other reported predators are mink, raccoons, herons, and crows. Next slide. So to take care of these predators, black terns will mob anything that comes too close to their nest. You can see in this picture here, I think there's about 6 black terns here, and the red arrow is pointing to a harrier hawk that is getting too close to their nesting area. So to me, they're very brave. I've seen them mob a bald eagle, and I've also seen them mob a juvenile goose that accidentally got too close. So they will mob anything. Me and my partners, when we're out there researching, we receive many head taps from angry parents. Next slide. Then why are we doing this work? Black terns are a common bird in very steep decline. Because of habitat degradation and loss of food, we've seen that their numbers seem to be decreasing rapidly. Next slide. So in St. Clair Flats, we actually have the largest black tern colony in Michigan. So here you can see I have Detroit is marked here, there's a little heart. And then St. Clair Flats is this red marker right here. And then here it is zoomed in on the right. You can see St. Clair Flats, and you can see how it's a delta kind of river emptying into a lake system. It's actually the world's largest delta. So it's really unique and really special. Black terns are listed as a species of special concern in Ontario, Michigan, and Minnesota. And then they're actually listed as state endangered in Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. So by studying the St. Clair Flats colony, we can better understand what is causing these populations to decrease and learn more about what we can do to try to reverse this decline. Next slide. So we start out our field research season by finding the nests and recording them on our nice GIS collector app here with this screenshot. And then here on the left, there is a nest right there. It's very hard to see. You can see that they're really good at making their eggs blend in, and their nests are very inconspicuous, so they're very hard to find. We actually have to find their nests by listening to the parents' calls. As we get closer, the parents will get more upset, and they'll call more often and more aggressively, and so it's kind of like a game of hot or colder, figuring out where the nest is. Next slide. At some of these nests, we've installed these really nice nest cameras, and these will take a picture every 30 seconds. And these are assisting with better understanding the nesting and fledging process for chicks, understanding how the change in water level affects the birds, and also understanding what are some of the most common reasons for nest failure. Next slide. Since 2013, Detroit Audubon has been capturing and banding black terns. We're using this data to create an integrated population model. To capture the adults, we set up these traps like this one here on the black tern nests. And when the terns come in to incubate their eggs, they will get caught in the trap. We hop out of the boat and wade through the water and go take the bird out of the trap. We will band the bird and take a couple measurements, and then as quickly as we can, just let the bird go and get back to incubating its eggs. Next slide. And then along with banding the adults, we also band the chicks, which is obviously very cute. Here on the left, you can see these two little guys are just hatched. Their sibling there in the egg should be hatching very soon. And then over on the right, we have a chick that's a little bit older. You can see a couple of the pin feathers are coming in. So sometimes we find the chicks sitting on the nest like this, especially when they're younger. But when they're older, they actually will start swimming and waddling around on the vegetation. They can actually move very fast. So that's really tricky finding those chicks sometimes. Next slide. So we have several conservation concerns. We don't know what seems to be the largest factor contributing to the black tern decline, but we do have many things that we believe are contributing. So first of all, limited food is definitely a factor. The black terns, like we mentioned, eat little fish and eat insects, and both of those are affected by pesticides, pollutants, overfishing, other ways that we manage the ecosystem. It really takes away a lot of their food. That affects them being able to feed and raise their chicks, needing enough insects for that. And that also affects them during their migration. As they're flying down to the wintering area or flying back, they need to be able to catch enough fish to keep up all of that energy. Another thing is that St. Clair Flats is very popular for boating and fishing, especially with larger motorboats. And so we really don't know if the wake created from these boats affects the nest much. And so that's something that we're trying to look into more, is comparing colonies that are closer and farther away from some of these boating paths and seeing if the waves and wake from boats has much of an effect on the nesting success. The limited nesting material is a really big concern of ours. The preferred nesting material for the black terns is called bulrush, but it's being outcompeted by the invasive Phragmites and the invasive hybrid cattail out at St. Clair Flats. These plants grow much denser than the black terns like. They really prefer nesting on the bulrush, but we have seen some of the birds have started to nest on this cattail and Phragmites, which is very interesting and could save this whole colony if they're able to adapt in that way. even with the added Phragmites and the cattail, the mats, the vegetation mats out at St. Clair Flats are still much thinner and therefore less sturdy and buoyant than the normal mats, than mats that we've seen in the past. And this really causes a problem with waves and increased water levels and flooding. This will slowly break apart the nest, and if the eggs have not hatched, or if the babies are too young to get to a drier area, that will definitely cause the nest to fail. Next slide. So one action that we will be taking for 2020 is installing these nesting platforms. So here you can see this nest on the left is a failed nest that really just, the mat was far too thin and it sunk into the water, broke apart. This definitely couldn't hold an egg or a young chick, and so this is a clear failure. So we will be installing these small nesting platforms. They're basically just little floating squares. These will be put in the water, kind of pushed under and slid over under the nest, and then you allow the platform to float back up, and it kind of lifts up the nest a little bit, and this will help keep the eggs and the chicks nice and dry, and then also helps the vegetation stay together, especially during wavy times or storms, so it doesn't kind of fall apart and sink into the water. So we will be testing if these platforms seem to have a significant effect on nesting success or not. We were originally planning to do a fun volunteer event making these platforms all together, but unfortunately COVID-19 has definitely ruined that plan for this year. So we will just be making the platforms ourselves and installing them and seeing what kind of effect they have. Next slide. Oh, there should have been a slide that says thank you, but yeah, so thank you to our volunteers and all of our partners. We could not do it without them. And thank you guys for listening.
Thank you so much, Ava. And again, we will be migrating on to our next speaker, who is Dave Moore, Senior Waterbird Biologist with Canadian Wildlife Service. And Dave will be discussing his work researching the movements of black terns and using telemetry and all kinds of technology. So welcome, Dave.
Thanks, Stephanie. Okay, if you could move on to the next slide, please. Hi, everyone. My thanks to all of you for taking an interest in black tern conservation and participating in this webinar. Really happy to be here, and I'm happy for the opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the research we've been doing on black tern annual movement patterns. And before I move on, I'd like to acknowledge Jeff Costa, who's my co-investigator for this project. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, there have been long-term range-wide declines for this species, and the declines have been really pronounced in the Great Lakes region. For example, we estimate that we've lost about 85% of our breeding sites and 70% of our nesting pairs here since the 1980s. Breeding habitat loss has occurred, and there are other factors that negatively affect breeding success. However, conditions during breeding do not appear to be the sole factors responsible for the population decline that we've seen. For example, a recent study in the US Great Lakes region found that many wetlands where black terns nested historically are now unoccupied, even though the suitable habitat appears to be available. It seems like other factors may be contributing. Like many migratory birds, 3/4 of the black tern's life cycle occurs outside of the breeding season. So an obvious question is, what's happening during the rest of the annual cycle? Are factors during non-breeding contributing to the population declines that we've observed? Until recently, this has been difficult to assess, as almost nothing was known regarding the non-breeding ecology of North American black terns. This question then is the focus of our research, and other colleagues that I'll mention later on. And basically, we're trying to gather information on migration routes, staging areas, winter locations, and the timing of these various events. Next slide, please. We conducted this study at 2 wetlands. The first was at Tiny Marsh at the south end of Georgian Bay in Ontario. And the second, as Ava talked about, was St. Clair Flat State Wildlife Area, which is on the northern shore of Lake St. Clair in Michigan. Next slide, please. We tracked adult terns using geolocators, which are small GPS tracking devices mounted on plastic leg bands, as you can see in these photos. These GPS tags weighed 3/4 gram, or about 1.3% of the bird's body mass, and had a battery life of about 2 years. Tags recorded the bird's GPS coordinates twice a day in both the morning and the evening. And in total, we recovered full annual cycle movement data for 14 terns. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll just, this is an animation that summarizes the annual movements of our study birds. In general, southward migration was staggered, varying from 8 to 84 days. Birds wintered along the northeastern coast of South America, from western Venezuela to northern Chile. And during northward migration, April and May was much faster, lasting between 9 and 25 days. And on average, the birds traveled around 16,000 kilometers round trip. Okay, next slide, please. This slide shows the same information, but in a different way. The first panel shows the southward migration tracks in blue. You can see here that most birds followed the Atlantic coast southward and spent time staging mainly in the Carolinas. Next slide, please. The next panel shows the wintering home ranges of our study birds, with the area around Panama being a hotspot. All birds spent at least part of the winter in that Panama area. Next slide, please. This last panel shows the northward tracks of birds in red. Most terns staged in the Gulf of Mexico and then returned to the breeding sites via the Mississippi Flyway, a completely different route than they took during the fall. Next slide, please. During this study, we found something completely unexpected. This slide shows the movement patterns of one bird over 2.5 annual cycles. It bred in Ontario in 2016, the year it was captured and received a GPS tag. Then in 2017, it briefly visited its original colony before heading to Manitoba and spending the summer there, presumably breeding. And this is a distance of about 1,400 kilometers between the two sites. During the next 2 summers, it returned to Ontario to breed. So this kind of flexibility may be more common than we previously thought. And it may shed some light on some other aspects of this bird's ecology that have been puzzling. First, genetics tells us that there is one big population in North America with lots of mixing rather than genetically distinct subpopulations. Movement by birds among breeding colonies would be consistent with this result. Second, estimated survival rates of adults are much lower than we'd expect compared to closely related species. Again, this pattern could make sense if some birds don't have a strong affinity to any particular breeding site or periodically switch among nesting sites. Next slide, please. Black terns live a double life. They're marsh birds during the breeding season and true seabirds the rest of the year. 13 of our 14 study birds use marine habitats in winter, while one bird mainly spent the winter inland. 5 of these terns used coastal habitats exclusively, and 8 birds used a mix of coastal and pelagic habitats and spent significant periods of time at sea. So these birds face different challenges and stressors depending on the time of year. Next slide, please. This tracking study is part of a larger project across North America with the goal to estimate the strength of the connection between breeding and wintering areas. This is important because it informs where we need to focus our conservation efforts. The green dots show sites where we've already deployed GPS tags. So the study I'm talking about in Ontario and Michigan, and then, oops, could you go back or forward one slide, please? And then colleagues of ours, Ann McKellar and Nick Shepard and Matthew Rudink, working out in the prairies, have also deployed tags that they will hopefully be retrieving this summer. The yellow dots show where this type of study is planned, and that's work that includes all of today's speakers, actually. So some tag deployments are postponed this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but we plan to continue this project and should have some results to share soon. Next slide, please. Understanding the annual movement patterns of black terns is important because it allows us to identify critical time periods and habitats and conservation threats for the species. It also allows us to estimate the strength of connectivity between breeding and non-breeding locations, and ultimately it helps us make more informed conservation decisions for the species. Next slide, please. As many of you probably know, yesterday was World Migratory Bird Day with the theme that birds connect our world. The black tern is a great example of why conservation of migratory birds requires a collaborative approach. First, we're building a network of researchers working on different facets of black tern ecology so that we can fit these various pieces together to gain a better understanding of the critical locations that they need, the time periods that are important, and the stressors they face, and actions that will maximize the conservation benefits. Secondly, international cooperation among partners is essential. Over the course of the year, our study birds resided in more than 18 countries on 2 continents. To end off, I hope that today's speakers have left you with the impression that there is indeed hope for the black tern. Next slide, please. I'd like to thank everyone for their attention and for attending. And if there's any, oh, sorry, habit. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, thank you so much, Dave. And yeah, we're all attending just virtually, so no worries. So we're going to be moving into our last presentation, and that will be Erin Rowan, who is a conservation associate for Audubon Great Lakes. And Erin will be speaking again on the expansion of our black tern work across the Great Lakes. So go ahead, Erin.
All right, great. Thanks, Stephanie. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'm really excited to chat with you all today about 2 additional monitoring sites in the state of Michigan, and then I'm also going to discuss some of the other work we've done at St. Clair Flats and some of the next steps we have planned at St. Clair Flats. Next slide. So the first site that we're going to chat about is the Ogons Bay location, which is in the Upper Peninsula. As you can see, Ogons Bay is part of the Big Bay Denok, and that red marker there indicates the wetland where those black terns are actually nesting. This site has been monitored by our partners at Common Coast Research and Conservation since 2016. Next slide. So results at this colony vary and are different from what we've seen at St. Clair Flats. This is a much smaller colony by comparison. Instead of hundreds of black terns, we're looking at fewer than 50. And colonies of this size are more likely to be abandoned than larger colonies. So Dave was talking about some of that inconsistency that can occur. This is one of the reasons why there's some inconsistency. Some years birds are here breeding, and since 2016 it looks like every other year this colony has been abandoned, with individuals returning every other year as well to breed. We also got some new predators on camera at this site. This is a common raven that was captured on camera. So this is not a predator that we would have to worry about at our Southeast Michigan locations, but it's definitely a predator that could impact breeding black tern colonies in the Upper Peninsula. This individual managed to eat eggs out of several nests the year it was found. Next slide. Our partners at Common Coast are also the folks that designed the nesting platform that Ava was talking about and really did some testing with black terns. And one of the reasons we're interested about this is not only to help keep nesting materials together, but because our Great Lakes naturally breathe. So this video is showing some of these water depth changes or water level changes that just happen naturally over the course of a day due to different weather patterns and changes in air pressure. But imagine, if you will, an even greater change in water levels due to a storm surge, I can't say those words, a storm surge, or a seiche, which is what happens after a storm surge, where great bodies of water are moving back and forth across the Great Lakes, but also at Lake St. Clair, and that can happen at a much faster rate as well over the course of 10 to 15 minutes. So this is not something that we are really able to monitor just yet as in how it has affected black terns, but it's something we're hoping to learn more about with the addition of our nest cameras and continued monitoring efforts, and hope that those nesting platforms can play a role in that. I also wanted to mention that here at Ogons Bay, terns are nesting in cattail, and as Ava mentioned, they definitely prefer bulrush at St. Clair Flats, and up until the last couple of years, we really thought that was their preferred nesting material. But at Ogons Bay, they've been nesting in native cattail since 2016, and it looks like so long as the cattail is not making up a majority of the marsh, it's not really a deterrent for these birds. And that's a perfect segue to go to our next slide and chat about our Wigwam Bay State Wildlife Area site. So Wigwam Bay State Wildlife Area doubles as an Audubon Important Bird Area and a Michigan Wetland Wonder. And this site is different from St. Clair Flats and Ogons Bay in that it's not an open coastal wetland. This is a fully impounded wetland complex. So it's surrounded by roughly 9 miles of dikes. There's not as much public or human disturbance to this site. There aren't as many invasive plant species as well here. But as you can see, there's a lot of tan mixed in there with the dark pockets of open water. And a lot of that tan are those dense stands of cattail. So we're excited about this project because in addition to monitoring black terns here, this colony varies in size between 60 and 100 individuals. We're also able to practice some management techniques to open up some cattail pockets and determine which management strategies are most effective, but also which ones the birds respond to the best. Next slide. And this is a view of one of our breeding areas we're paddling out to at Wigwam Bay. Again, very different. We're not seeing the same mats of nesting vegetation that we do at St. Clair Flats and Ogons. There's not a lot of dead cattail or bulrush. And instead, this is the location where Ava mentioned the birds are nesting on these muck mats. Next slide. So the muck mats at Wigwam Bay are primarily tussock sedge muck mats, which is what's pictured here. And tussock sedge is more of like a bunch grass that floats in the wetland. And as their root balls kind of fall apart and biodegrade, they turn into these muck mats that float up from the bottom of the wetland as water temperatures get warm every spring. So it takes until about May for these to even arrive at the surface of the water, and then the terns start to nest on them. And we see a great variety in how built up the nests are on these muck mats. Some individuals just lay their eggs right in a cup of the muck without building up added nesting material, whereas others add additional 2 inches or so of nesting material around the eggs. The muck mats themselves are much sturdier than the cattail and bulrush mats. Even if a storm moves through or there's a lot of wind, these aren't falling apart easily. They're quite thick and heavy, very difficult to move through as well when we're paddling in our canoe. But we have seen that a lot of these nests do tend to succeed to hatching stage. Next slide. So in addition to our regular nest monitoring that we also do at St. Clair Flats, we do those at Wigwam Bay as well. And we additionally trap the adults here using these passive traps. And then we also band adults and chicks at Wigwam. Next slide, please. And I wanted to take a moment to share a story about a particular individual bird that we've banded at Wigwam. This female is the most vigilant black tern adult I've come across. And she's on the head of our intern, Jenny Fuller from U of M here, watching me as I band her 3 chicks. She was originally banded by Ava at Wigwam in 2018 and then recaptured by Jenny last year. And we knew that we'd be able to get her right away because she was so vigilant and protective of her nest, even when her eggs were fresh, which is unusual. Typically, terns are most invested in their nest about a week before the hatch date. But we managed to catch her on day 1. She was the first bird of the season, and then we returned to her nest 3 weeks later to band her chicks. I'm going to ask that you keep her in your thoughts as we move forward into the next slide. She received the yellow #1 band, so she's going to be our yellow 1. Next slide. So looking at threats to nesting success at Wigwam, we mentioned those muck mats are much sturdier, but flooding can still be an issue. If we have a storm where we get a few inches of rain, the lily pad muck mats are much closer to the surface water level. And so the water will just sit on top of those muck mats, and those muck mats won't be able to rise up. They are likely still attached to the wetland floor. So those nests have been flooded out in the past, whereas those tussock sedge nests, like the one pictured, are high enough off the water that even if we get added rain or wind moving water around, that those nests stay intact. Next slide. So thinking about predation, this is a predator we caught on camera. Next slide as well for a second image of the raccoon. This individual raccoon managed to get out off the dike and fared the water for a midnight snack and managed to eat eggs out of 5 to 6 nests in this tussock sedge subcolony. And this is very close to where our yellow 1's nest was. So I think that again, her defensive behavior, it really paid off. She managed to bomb likely this raccoon to the point that he didn't want to get near her nest, and which succeeded in getting her eggs to hatching stage. Next slide. So when Dave joined our project back in 2017 and brought geolocators to the project, he also introduced us to Modus wildlife tracking technology, which uses radio telemetry tags like the one pictured on the back of the adult black tern on the right. And these are really lightweight radio tags that emit a unique signal for each individual. And so long as the individual birds fly within 12 kilometers of one of the Modus receiver towers, which are represented by all the yellow dots on that map, their signal will be picked up. And so this is a great way to passively track wildlife movement. And there's a whole network of Modus receiver towers all the way down to their wintering grounds. And they're spreading across the globe, which is really great. Next slide. We've got a photo of one of those receiver towers that we have at Harson's Island that Dave helped us get set up. And we're also in the process of getting 2 additional towers set up on the west side of Lake St. Clair, and then a 3rd up at Wigwam Bay State Wildlife Area. Because last year and this year, hopefully, we will be getting nano tags out on pre-fledged chicks as well, because this is going to help us answer the question, how many chicks are successfully fledging, not just successfully hatching? And it's very hard to measure that in the field, because after 3 days of age, these chicks can swim away from the nest and they blend in really well with their surroundings. They can be very difficult to find again. Next slide. And in addition to adding nanotags to pre-fledged chicks, last year we also added color bands to our banding kits at Wigwam and St. Clair Flats. So now adults and chicks have yellow, neon green, neon pink, and brown colored bands on one leg and then the stainless steel bands on the other. So we're hoping that some of these individuals will be resighted so we don't have to rely on recapturing individuals to determine whether or not they survived from year to year. So if you are out birding and you're able to spot some black terns congregating during migration and you happen to photograph some and see that they have color bands, please let us know, submit those sightings to the bird banding lab, and eventually that data will make its way back to us. Next slide, please. And then I also wanted to take a minute to chat about our recent grant that we were awarded from Michigan DNR to do some habitat work similar to what we're doing at Wigwam Bay at St. Clair Flats State Wildlife Area. Now, most of the black terns at St. Clair Flats don't actually nest within the diked State Wildlife Area, but instead nest just to the left of that green portion of the map and north of that, northwest of the State Wildlife Area, in areas that are completely open and very much impacted by human disturbance potentially and the effects of storms. So we're hoping that with some of the protection we've seen of nests up at Wigwam Bay that we might be able to encourage some of these black terns to nest within the East Marsh unit or the reddish unit to the right of that map. By creating some openings in the dense cattail stands within that unit and leaving the cut debris behind, hopefully creating some nesting material that they might nest on. We've seen 30 to 50 adults eat in this unit in the past throughout every May. Usually these are adults that are migrating through or before they settle down to start nesting at St. Clair Flats, but we've only had one pair of black terns actually nest within this unit. So we're hoping we can increase those numbers. This habitat work is also going to benefit secretive marsh birds and waterfowl in the area, who are also big fans of all the agriculture food crops that you can see as well in that aerial image. Next slide, please. So our ultimate goal is to continue this kind of monitoring effort across the Great Lakes region. We really want to get a snapshot of the population of breeding black terns. And we are in the process, as Ava said, of developing a population model with all the data we've collected to date. And we're hoping that we can analyze the banding and recapture records to help us determine if the issue across the board is adult survivorship, not as many adults are returning each year to breed, or if there aren't enough chicks being produced each year and successfully fledging to replenish that population. And then we also want to identify areas of high conservation value like St. Clair Flats or Wigwam Bay, who are both important bird areas, to prioritize for continued monitoring and habitat work. Next slide. And none of that work could be possible without our partners. Like Ava said, we want to thank those that couldn't be part of tonight's presentation, our friends at Michigan DNR, Detroit Zoo, Common Coast Research and Conservation, Indiana University, and U of M. And that's it for my presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Erin, and thank you to all of our presenters today, and thank you all again for attending. I just want to let you know that we do have a few extra little slides at the end, but we want to get through those first, and then stay tuned, stay with us, because we're going to be doing Q&A. There are several questions that were entered in the chat and on Facebook Live as well, so we're going to answer those questions. If you have any more questions, please enter them now, and we'll give it back to Erin.
All right, great. Thanks, Stephanie. So before we move on to our Q&A, we just wanted to share some information on what you can do to help black terns. So like I mentioned, if you do encounter a color-banded black tern, please submit that observation and any photos you happen to take to the bird banding lab. And you could also sign up for eBird if you haven't already to submit any sightings you have of Black Terns. You could also advocate for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which funds coastal wetland restoration. And lastly, you could volunteer as a steward of your local public lands and waters in your community. Next slide. And we also strongly encourage you to join us, Audubon Great Lakes, again on Thursday, May 28th, for our upcoming webinar on secretive marsh birds. Please refer to the registration link in the chat box to sign up today. And you can also stay in touch with Audubon Great Lakes, visit our website, or you can shoot us an email. And you can also follow us on social media. As you can see, we're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And for all of you attendees, please keep a lookout for a follow-up email in the coming days with a webinar feedback form. All right, I'm going to pass things back on to Stephanie for the Q&A.
Thank you so much. We do have a few questions for our panelists, so I'll start from some that we received in the chat. And if you've been paying attention to the chat, we've also been answering some of those questions as they come up as well. But we'll circle back to some of the questions that were asked earlier and make sure that our listeners can get some of the answers to some of these important questions. So one that was from earlier for Don, there was a question about whether there's roseate terns that are breeding at Eastern Egg Rock Island.
Yeah, thank you for the question. There are, in fact, roseate terns nesting at Eastern Egg Rock in Maine, and actually 2 or 3 other islands, depending on the year. But it's relatively small numbers. So around 90% of the population, the U.S. population, breeds at those 3 islands in New York and Massachusetts. And so a huge part of the population is vulnerable to any conservation challenge that happens in that area. We're working really hard in Maine to grow our colonies, and we hope to do that in the coming years. But as of right now, they're still pretty small.
All right, the next question we have, I guess, Don, you might be able to answer this because you were talking about threats to seabirds. Someone wanted to know whether or not cormorants are a threat to terns.
Yeah, cormorants and terns coexist in a lot of places around the world, really, a lot of places in North America too. So the only way they really conflict is through competing for resources, like space on an island, for example. Cormorants don't nest in the same places as black terns. They just use very different types of habitat. So there's not really much of any interaction between cormorants and black terns. And cormorants are much bigger, so they tend to eat bigger types of prey, and not the aerial insects that black terns sometimes eat. So there's not much overlap there. And even for species of terns and cormorants that nest together, usually it's just competing for space on a given island, is how they, if there's any conflict at all.
Thanks. I'm going to send over, I have 2 related questions about the breeding range of black terns. I'll give that to Erin or anyone else who wants to answer these. They wanted to know, do black terns mainly live near the Great Lakes? And then in relation to that, someone wanted to know if black terns breed along the Gulf Coast. I know we saw a range map at some point, but maybe you can take that.
Yeah, so black terns are breeding in coastal as well as inland wetlands. So they are definitely nesting near the Great Lakes and in wetlands adjacent to the Great Lakes, but they are also found inland of the Great Lakes and north up in Canada, away from the Great Lakes within the boreal forests. As far as the coast of Florida and southern Atlantic coast, that's mostly a staging ground during migration, and that's not an area where they're breeding.
All right, thanks. So just taking a look at some other questions. See, oh, there was a question for Dave, wanting to know what the recapture rate is for the birds that have the geolocators.
I think, yeah, I answered that on the chat, but we had reciting the birds, so reciting our geolocator birds was about 60%, but actually recapturing them was in the 40 to 45% range. So it's a function of the habitat. It's really difficult to see the birds a lot of the time, and we ended up using cameras like that was discussed earlier. We used the cameras to actually ID who was at the nest. Was it a tag bird or not tag bird? So thanks. Good question.
All right. So another question for Erin, or maybe others if they have the answer to this. Someone wanted to know if Eastern Massasauga, which is a snake, is one of the predators for black terns.
So say, well, we've seen them on Harson's Island within St. Clair Flats. We have not seen them in the water in our nesting areas. Luckily, we have seen the northern water snakes, though, swimming out to breeding colonies, and some quite large ones being mobbed by adults. So we do suspect they're out there potentially eating eggs.
All right, and I want to make sure I have some questions for Ava as well. Someone asked, how does one tell the difference between the male and a female from a distance?
Yeah, we definitely can't tell difference between male and female from a distance. But when we do capture them and have them in hand, we're able to look at the body sizes, and usually the male is larger than the female. So the regular measurements that we take to compare are the length of the head and the beak together, and then just the length of the beak. And we kind of compare those and generally assume that the larger one is the male. There was also a question about what type of camera we use. And we use last year we used Bushnell cameras out at St. Clair Flats. But we are looking into also the Cabela Outfitter Generation 2.
Great, thank you. I was just about to ask you that one. All right, so some good questions that are just coming in on the chat too. One person asked, what is the status of the Migratory Bird Act and how has it affected the black tern? Well, I guess that's a really good question. Does anyone have an answer for that?
Yes, Stephanie, I could speak to that.
Oh, great, thank you.
Yeah, so the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, I mentioned, was approved in 1918. The first part of that was a treaty with Canada, and that act has been in place for now over 100 years. The current federal administration has interpreted that act differently than all the previous administrations, and it is changing the way some of the tenets are enforced. Audubon is actually one of a group of organizations that have brought a lawsuit to return the interpretation of the act to the former understanding of how it was written. And there's also new legislation in Congress under consideration that would clarify this point and renew the protections that we're accustomed to under this act. Several states are acting on their own to enforce the aspects of the act at the state level. California and Virginia are most notable among those, but definitely that's an issue very much in play. And if you're interested, we can provide more information. Audubon is certainly actively working to ensure those protections remain in force.
Great, thank you so much, Don. Yeah, so you can learn more about that on Audubon's website and how you can help out terns. There's some information on the screen here, gl.audubon.org as well. A few other questions, and then we'll close for the night. But one was that came in recently. Wanted to know about the colony at Ogons for Erin. And I can answer this too if you don't, but they wanted to know what happened because they didn't nest every year where they found in other locations.
Yeah, so far we don't know where they have nested in the years they haven't been at Ogons, but looking at Dave's geolocator results, it does look like they could be nesting elsewhere. We just have not determined where that is just yet with those birds.
And another question for Erin was about whether or not we know anything about post-fledging survival and juvenile dispersal.
So that's something we're hoping to learn more about. That's the area that is very gray with Black Tern juveniles. To the best of my understanding, we haven't had any geolocators out on juvenile birds, but with the nano tags going out on pre-fledged chicks, we should be able to see those tags should last a few months into their migration, so we can learn about their migratory movements as well, and compare that to adults and see if it's similar or different in any way. And then as far as dispersal, I think it's a great area of research that we could look into for future monitoring efforts, because yeah, right now it's a big unknown.
All right, so I just have two more questions. So one, I'll ask Ava if you want to answer this one about with failed nests, what is the reason that they fail? Is it because of habitat or something else, like inexperienced young birds that have just picked a bad spot to nest in?
I think it can definitely be a combination of those. With the lack of suitable habitat, it can be difficult to find an area where they're able to be protected from flooding and the increased storm activity. So it can be something that is the birds are not in control of at all. I think it is more an issue of habitat and not of younger birds picking an area that's not as well suited. So there's failures from flooding and storms, predators, and also if the babies could also not make it because of limited food.
All right, thanks, Ava. So for our last question, I'll pitch it over to Dave, but also everyone else is willing to answer this as well. They want to know, cameras and geolocators can be expensive. Yes, this is true. Do various Black Tern projects need donations? And if so, where can people donate to?
To me?
Well, you're the geolocator.
Yeah, so
person,
that slide near the end where it showed this, you know, big collaborative project of people deploying tags across, you know, the whole continent from coast to coast, like that. Yeah, I'm sure people, it's a lot of individuals from universities, government, NGOs, like, so I'm sure some of those folks would really benefit from donations. I'm just not sure offhand what mechanism that would be used to do that, but if somebody wants to touch base with one of you guys, and like, yeah, that would be awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe that's something we can follow up with people. In the meantime, you're more than welcome to visit gl.audubon.org, and there's an option to donate there, as well as if you visit Detroit Audubon's social media and website, they also accept donations. And so yeah, that's a wrap. Thank you all so much, and have a good evening. And we'll see you next time at our next webinar, May 28th.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Hmm.